Welcome to another interactive session with corporate executives, industry experts, and influential people in our society. Today, I have a very special guest with me, and he is very calm, collected, handsome, charming, but very intelligent individual. And his name is Zion Adeoye. He's the managing director of the Centurion Law Group, one of the largest law firms in Africa with offices scattered across the African continent and also listed on the German Stock Exchange.
Thank you, Michael. Zion Adeoye, as you've already introduced, a lawyer specializing in the energy sector. Well, unlike many lawyers or professionals, I think I've always had interest in the energy sector, specifically the oil and gas sector. So I started, in 2009 with the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation as a couple then, the National Youth Service, and proceeded to work in a number of, establishments, law firms. Also had a brief spell at KPMG and a couple of law firms in Nigeria focused on energy, oil and gas. So I've always had that interest, and the interest was because I felt that was one thing that, could drive the growth of Africa. Even as a student in the secondary school, I, wrote essays about what I wanted to do in future, and I always wanted to be a lawyer and, an oil and gas lawyer for some reason. So, yeah, I guess that interest led me to seek out opportunities that were, particularly targeted at that. And, looking back about 15 years now in the legal profession, I'm happy about the level of impact I've been able to have, in the oil and gas sector.
Fantastic. Having young leaders like you in Africa, spells out hope for a lot of the African youth. Looking at people like yourselves thriving and putting together, legal structures to develop Africa. That's a thing that I'd say it's uncommon, but perhaps we are beginning to see the trend of young leaders like yourself taking up the mantle and moving things across the continent. And that's, I'm sure, to the viewers and to your mentors, to people that view you as a mentor out there, this is something very satisfactory. So, Dan, what can you say currently about the energy crisis in South Africa and Nigeria? To the naive people out there, we don't necessarily understand what is happening so much. All we see is there's no energy. All we see is there's load shedding. All we see is there's insufficient electricity. What can you just say in a short summary of what really is going on in South Africa and Nigeria?
I think before I get to that, let me backtrack to what you mentioned about being young and having the opportunity. I think in reality, no one really takes the mantle. The mantle will be given. To some extent, I was lucky in industry to have mentors and to have seniors and employers who believed in young people. I must mention, one of my biggest mentors, Professor Yinka Murube, who as my dean of the faculty and also as my boss and also, legal director and NPC gave me opportunities, even as a young professional, down to the extent that there was that exposure to the industry. Many people are not that lucky, and it's important to mention that also. Adeoye was the CEO of Centurion Law Group, and having people like that that believe in younger people and allow them to thrive, allow them to make their shares mistake is very important. And I think across the continent that's one thing that is missing, and that's why a lot of young people are not able to attain positions. Now you say I'm young, but I'm not young. I'm almost 40. Perhaps that's young, in Africa, because we've always made youth leaders of tomorrow, not today, where they're most active and thriving. But I must say that those people who I've worked with, several other organizations, not so many I would mention, but that opportunity has led to what I've been able to achieve, today. Now, getting to your question, I think there's no argument for the fact that energy, is the feedstock for development, and the difference between developed nations and developing nations, and also underdeveloped nations, is the amount of energy they've been able to put to work, right, over the years. Africa has never lacked the raw materials, the mineral resources, but we've always not had sufficient a system to put things in place for Africa. So most of our resources have been channeled out of the continent for centuries. And also, while not blaming the victim, we've also not played our part in cooperation and collaboration to ensure that African affairs, or Africa, as a structure, is able to thrive and compete with the rest of the world. There were times, past the colonial periods, where perhaps we did not have that opportunity or strength to be able to take our own content, in the global scheme of things. The way the world is wired today, we were never really at the table to determine how those things, happen. And when you're not at the table to determine how it's done, do not expect decisions or the system to be skewed right, in your favor. So coming down to what South Africa is experiencing, I think South Africa is experiencing what every other African system, experiences, which is a failure of leadership to continuously develop, a system. I think South Africa has been through its struggles and should actually be the best example from Africa. And as bad as the South African energy situation is now, it's unfortunate that's still one of the better examples. I lived in Nigeria, where I can count the days where there was actually power from what we call the mains, or from NEPA then, Electric Power Authority. We all had to produce our electricity by ourselves. The sound of generators, still ring in my ears, even though I lived in Nigeria for about 7 years.
Wow.
And the fact is, South Africa still has hope. You have a customer base which is used to paying for utilities. You have a fully developed, market, right, and with the right legislation and regulation, and also perhaps some sort of liberalization of the system. Right. You would allow players that can really make a difference to come into the power sector. You cannot legislate or incentivize away bad management and inefficiency. That's something that we've struggled with in Africa, we continue to struggle with. And we must have serious conversations with ourselves on how to deal with this. But there is hope. I think I think the government's taking it very seriously now and having the conversations. But you must have the right structures. Regulation, legislation, very important. Starts from policy, and then you have legislation, and then you have regulations to ensure that day to day you can be flexible enough to meet changing circumstances. So for South Africa, I think the story is still being written on the energy sector. But again, one thing is that South Africa would have to understand that its transition from coal, which forms at least 70% of its electricity generation or energy supply, would have to be done to perhaps natural gas. There's abundance of gas in Mozambique. South Africa does have its own as well. There's Namibia, and certainly there are, options for modular, sort of partnerships, all sorts of things that can take advantage of. With the kind of market that South Africa has, which is crystallized already,
Right.
it should not, suffer what it's suffering in terms of load shedding or, whatever it's called over here. So I think with some level of dedication the government is showing, in the near future, I am actually optimistic that things will change.
Change. Absolutely. Well, that's a little bit of hope there from Zion. Zion, you touched on leadership here in Africa, and the issue of leadership seems to be a very interesting topic or conversation to touch on. You believe that Africa obviously has a very peculiar leadership challenge. Is there a hub do we require a hub to train future leaders? You've also touched on the potentials of gas in Mozambique and etc. But in Africa, we seem to have the problem of even trading amongst ourselves, and that's also another issue. Then we have the legal structures, which you touched on, that we need to have some proper, legal structures to guide, the implementation of some of these policies. But the legal structures here, Africa seems to have a lot of legal structures in place, but when it comes to enforcing these regulations is also another thing. Then we have the issue of corruption coming in, that people seem to, get away or around the law. They are untouchable, in quotes. And could that also be a challenge that's affecting this energy deficit? I mean, discipline, in a nutshell, seems to be the key word here. We are lacking this discipline, and that's really affecting us badly. What's your take on that?
Yeah, there are many aspects to that. I think taking it from the top, when it comes to the issue of corruption, what can combat corruption is systems that are set up and that cannot be easily rigged. There's no amount of anti-corruption laws or the executive, waking one day and saying, this administration is all about anti-corruption, which happens all the time, which is, just, I feel, a political gimmick used to get subscription from the electorate. That's not how it works. If you look at crystallized systems, developed nations, they have systems, it's not just about executive, it's about systems, that are set up and developed over long time, stress tested to the point where, they stand the test of time. So we need to start to focus on developing systems. What have you? I think as a lawyer, I feel the judiciary in Africa is perhaps failed. That's a very heavy word to use, but perhaps failed because redress for the systems, for political use of political power, even in the private sector, all that goes on can be had at the judiciary, but this is often lacking, and then the last resort for those who are concerned enough or affected enough to actually try to push back against system of corruption. Constant failure of that crop of people leads to a system where anything goes. So in terms of leadership, certainly I think there are leaders in the private sector, there are leaders in different circles, but the positioning has been really bad. We've not had good examples of leadership where it matters the most. Compared to when we were much younger or in the past. I think Africa did have leaders. You could point to, Kwame Nkrumah, who grew up with those names, and we could. There were problems. Many of the people we deify had issues of bigotry and all that, and we have to be very honest with ourselves that we did have those issues, but in terms of what the youth could look forward to and emulate and imbibe, there was a lot more then back then than we have now. I think the fact that we do have a young population might actually be something that will help Africa. I mean, the average age in a country like Nigeria is about 19 years. So I think the youth are putting things together. You saw what happened in the recent elections, and but also there's opportunity, I always say, for leadership in the private sector. It's not until you become the president of a country that you can actually lead a revolution, a positive one that leads to some, positive change across the continent. And we also need to understand economics. We need to understand that Africa is not one country, but when the global affairs are being dealt, Africa is treated as that. So I think the pushback to gain ascendancy, as a continent must also be concerted. I always say the concept of shared prosperity is something that is missing for Africans.
I agree.
For African countries to aggregate and unite, I don't think it's from a kumbaya perspective. I think it makes business sense.
Yes.
Give an example. The US and China, if you watch CNN, you think, they have guns pointed at themselves every second. Perhaps they do, but they're each other's biggest trade partners.
Right.
And perhaps what, has precluded doom today is the fact that if anything goes down, along those lines, all of that trade falls apart. They say the American dream is perhaps made in China. So we need to understand that. And if unwholesome tendencies will prevent us from doing business together, the issue of visa-free Africa should not be a problem. Though it's admittedly there should be more even development, across. But when you talk about GDP, when you talk about development, it's about human activity. So, what is the African GDP if Africans are bounded to their separate countries and cannot move around or prospect, across the continent? Right. I mean, the ability of a young European to prospect across the entire union, you cannot place a price on that.
Absolutely.
And that's also movement of people creating businesses, and business subscription across that system. So we have to understand why it is important. It's not just about leisure travel or immigration. There's a business perspective that and also the go it alone strategy, adopted by many countries across the continent, was a huge economic failure because we are wasting our natural monopolies. A country as small as Equatorial Guinea should not have a project that is, specifically for that country. There has to be a regional play where Cameroon, Nigeria, all subscribe to that project. Look at the entire region and say, we have gas here, you have gas, what can we do? I feel more of that's been done, but a lot has been wasted. And for as long as that investment comes into the country and, must be repatriated for you to, not have an expropriatory status, then, you are perhaps jeopardizing the future, finances of the country. So some of these conversations, I think African leaders, the business community, if the leaders are, doing their own thing, must be having to ensure that, there's an Africa play. They'll say, you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, you have to go together. Three, sector cord cannot be easily broken. That's just
absolutely.
The way it is.
I agree with that. Yeah. I agree with that. Speaking of the unification of Africa, we have I think, and I like your choice of words to say that we have to be able to call it upon ourselves. We have to speak frankly. I mean, some of these challenges have been there for a while, and I think we are not being honest to ourselves as Africans. They have the Africa peer review where we are supposed to, that's the purpose is supposed to be serving, where we're supposed to be able to call or tell it upon ourselves and say, look, you've been here in this leadership position for quite some time. You haven't done what you're supposed to do, but it seems that I don't know if it's the culture thing where we are afraid or shy. I don't know which one it is to point out honestly amongst our own peers or neighbors to say that you're not doing the right thing over there. And yes, we have had this issue of even amongst ourselves Africans where we are limited to move to other neighboring countries in Africa, but it's quite easier for even Europeans to visit, you know, and exploit business opportunities. Whereas, I mean, you have people from Ghana who have never been to South Africa. You have people from Nigeria who have never been to Mozambique. And if you look at it, it's probably because they probably require a visa, which is another process, you know, to do that. Do you believe that Africa at some point would unite in terms of economic integration, business, free borders? You think, because I know that if you look at the African Union, they have their Agenda 2063, and this is one of their key agendas to open borders. But this has been happening, Zion.
You know, it's not about what I think. I hope that what will force us to unite will not be, you know, abject.
Tell me more about that. I like to hear that.
Abject poverty within the continent. I mean, we talk about over 600 million people without electricity today in Africa. That's ridiculous with the level of oil and gas we have, with the level of, you know, technologies that have been deployed. It just shows the level, you know, and globally as well. It's a bad play because the world is, you know, perhaps not realizing its full potential, because Africa, not just the land, not just the resources, the human resources itself. You can see what, you know, immigration is happening in Canada, in Europe, you know, Nigerians, Cameroonians, and you know, Ghanaians, all that going there. Africa has got that content which the world needs. So it's not just about Africa, and perhaps there is a better world if Africa is able to you know, realize its potential.
Right.
For us, I think for Africa, there's always been what would I say, shackles of the mind, and we need to understand these things. As I said before, African cooperation makes economic sense, makes business sense. It's not just about the fact that we're black.
Right.
It's the fact that we are fighting the same things, you know.
The same battle.
Same battle. So uniting to surmount, you know, what the struggles are, you know, just makes sense, you know, basically makes sense. And until we realize that, until we actually put that in action, of course, the free continental trade, you know, agreement helps, but it should not just be a concept. It must be practicalized. You gave the example of Ghanaians who have not been to South Africa, and those Nigerians who have not been to Mozambique. It's not just about their travel, as I said. It's that's business. That's airlines are able to have, you know, more customers. There's also a lot of
infrastructure.
You know, so many things going on when that happens, when people move around. There's economic activity.
Absolutely.
And then results in the development of those areas where, you know, people are moving to, and there's opportunity for more collaboration, and also even for development of laws, because you have to do a stress test. You cannot just, for the fear of extreme immigration, decide to close your borders entirely. Then you close opportunities that you know, could be seeds today for you know. Also, I think we have to be bolder in our ambitions, because when I see African programs, you say the Africa we want to be perhaps in 2030 or 2050. You know, anything you set in, you know, 1994, 2025 would have been truncated by, you know, COVID.
True.
So we have to set bolder, shorter term goals and
realistic
collaborate.
ones.
You know, sometimes if your dreams do not scare you, you're not dreaming big enough. So
I agree.
The idea is you have to set targets, because you are speaking of a continent with resources, you know, which, you know, richest countries like DRC should be some of the most, you know, wealthiest countries in the world, some of the wealthiest countries in the world. And you see that the DRC GDP compared to Nigeria, South Africa is significantly low, and the level of development as well. So there's something wrong there. But activating that with regional play perhaps gives a better opportunity to gain the ascendancy, economic ascendancy necessary to compete in the world.
I agree, Zion. There's definitely something wrong over there. But this is where the thought-provoking question sets in, Ian. Our leadership. These are guys who are schooled, educated. These are guys who have traveled abroad, have seen developed countries. These are guys who themselves, some of them have been educated outside of Africa. Some of them own properties, use access the medical services in Europe, America, Canada, Australia, the rest of the world. But when it comes to, what I'm saying is these guys are knowledgeable. So I won't say they don't know the challenges that Africa has. They are aware. So then my question is it just the lack of will to develop the continent? Is it corruption? Is it selfishness? Is it that I don't care because I have made my wealth, I have secured my family, so I'm content and the rest can rot in hell? Is it the kind of mindset that we have as leadership in Africa? Because I don't seem to understand. Is the leadership, are they just short-sighted? Because they are aware. We complain every day. They are aware of the situation. They cannot be. They've studied about it. But when it comes to action, and I look at the policies, some of them, sometimes they put in place. But when it comes to, we are good on paper. In Africa, we are very good on writing and futuristic goals and policies and meetings and conferences. We are very good at that. And we discuss. But after the conference, after the meeting, we go back to our houses and everything seems to slow down. Do we need some sort of regulatory framework that would action us? I mean, you're a lawyer. Tell us about that, because I'm lost.
There are places where there's so many fundamental issues, and I'll take some of them. There are places where regulation can help. I'll give an example. South Africa is struggling with energy, and it's got gas. It's been battling in the courts regarding developing that gas. The reason why there's that battle, I'll just start briefly on that, is because there's no proper legislation to say this is the law of the land. We are developing our gas. We have energy needs and we must do that. There are places, but in so many respects, we do not need more laws or regulations. We need action. We need an understanding of what government is. There's the strategy management part of it and the risk management part of it that African nations have not really understood. For several industries, our biggest industries, we dole out incentives which are necessary for foreign investors to come. But I feel like governments many times in Africa do not do the bare minimum necessary. They do not put the skin in the game to activate, because it's a cliche, we will pays the piper dictates the tune. There's opportunity to be bigger partners in the development of a country, because every country in Africa is seeking for foreign investments, and foreign investments necessary, but we've not been able to use what we have internally to have more stake, more equity in that development, so that those structures are not just created to repatriate. So we remain perpetually in a repatriation scenario, and now it's gone to the excess where Africa's in debt for generations to come if nothing changes. Other fundamental issues, I mentioned before, that when the decision of how the system of the world will work, when those decisions were being made, Africa has not been at the table. And I think with in renewed understanding, flow of information, and the resources we have genuinely, Africa needs to go back to that table and say, now we're at that table, so and so. We live, I always say, we live in a rock, paper, scissors world where paper, covers rock. So the US dollar matters more than the gold that South Africa and DRC, have, combined. And think about the resources in Africa, that cannot be overemphasized. So we need to reset what we have against the world. We need to combine our our strategies. We need to combine our strengths,
Right.
and re-engage with the world. Sometimes some of this is about having that conversation and insisting. We've had several conferences and whatever that mark the direction of the world.
Right.
Africa needs to engineer a new conference that says this continent is important to the world for the foreseeable future. The least polluter of the environment, one of the richest in natural resources. This play does not work. And have that conversation and be serious about it and start to re-engineer a world that favors Africa, because we're so far behind. I do not think that individual successes, and perhaps that's a bit pessimistic, will be sufficient to
get us where we want to go.
Engender, some sort of ascendancy, economic, which is important for. I mean, the economic justice part of the world must still come to play. So there are a number of fundamental issues. On the issue of leadership, I think clearly we do not have the stock of leadership that. But I say, do not look at leadership in the public sphere alone. Private sector leadership. I see that's going on, especially in the information technology age. A lot of young people. At one time I was in KPMG, and so many of my colleagues are leaders of fintech, very thriving, very successful, and that's encouraging to say. These are still very young people, 30, between 30 and 35, doing very well. So. That itself is leadership. Do not look at the position of the president or the governor, because at the end of the day, when it comes to job creation, it's not got money in government's hands or government. It's the private sector. That's where the jobs come from.
Absolutely.
That's where actually industrial development comes from. Government's role is to engender, is to signal, is to
create that conducive environment,
and also to collaborate, because I can want to do business in Ghana as much as I want. If the laws do not permit the collaboration for those two countries to, really, and in terms of taxation, in terms of movement of goods and all that, that will keep me, stuck, where I am.
Zal is giving a very interesting point over there, and so it's not like the youth of Africa are not lazy. They are very zealous. They are. They have the willpower. They want to build things for themselves if they're given that conducive environment to thrive. Zion, you've really touched on some very, very important fact here. So would you say that Africa needs a total overhaul in terms of the legal framework, to restructure the whole legal framework, or must we continue to build on what we're building? I mean, if you look at, from my perspective, most of the legal frameworks that we have in Africa was inherited from our colonizers. So there's a school of thought that might not necessarily be what Africa needed to help us thrive. Perhaps we needed to have set our own laws, or constitutions that would have enabled us to thrive faster. What is your narrative on that? Do you think we need an overhaul, or we continue to restructure and build what's existing?
I think it's about facing the right direction with what you have. You can have, if you put on your suit and you drive your car towards, the beach, you're not going to work.
Absolutely.
This is where, we just have to start facing the right direction, because the blame game would never stop. A country like Nigeria, with all of its resources, was colonized for about 100 years. Now you could blame that, we have 100 years deficit too. But the tools you have today, we have to start from somewhere.
Absolutely.
And understand that, this is what we have. The brains, the innovation and everything will be coming from Africa in for the next 20 years. The average age in Africa, for example, is about 20 years. Europe is about 40 years.
Right.
That means something.
It does.
Nigeria, for example, 200 million. That's about a quarter of, Europe. That means the underdevelopment is an opportunity as well, because that means there's untapped economy that
Right.
can be developed with new technologies. With the oil and gas we have, especially gas, I feel gas is a transformational resource, and understanding that Nigeria's got, the whole of Africa's got, a lot of gas. See what's happening in Namibia, Mozambique, and all that. That's where that collaboration can come to play to ensure that a South Africa, for example, which is a thriving economy with potential externality for other, could be the hub for development across the continent. If the resources are there, gas in Mozambique, in Namibia, and Nigeria, how about having some sort of project that, government to government, have a development plan to put XYZ here, and if the American dream is made in China, why can't the South African one be made in Nigeria?
Absolutely.
And it works.
Right.
Trade collaboration actually works because you save a lot of wasted development.
Right.
What they say, white elephant projects. We do have a lot of that.
Yes.
In Africa, there's no reason why Uganda is proposing to spend billions, in refinery. Except there's a regional play, because that's not sufficient, and those resources could be used for more things that would have more developmental effect. So we do have to be more strategic. I think strategic management is a problem in Africa. Governments just do projects. The fact is, you just list a number of projects and you want to actualize. So what is the big play? What is the national play? What's the regional play? How does this all fit into, and what's the benefits in the long term? So just doing things for doing sake is perhaps one of the biggest problems, we have in African leadership. There's a content problem in terms of individuals as well. There is, and we must face that. We must be very honest with that. The youth are not looking up to anyone, and I think the development you see in the private sector of Nigeria is due to austerity, because growing up, you have to be your own power provider through generators. You have to do a borehole to get your
you're self-reliant on yourself now.
Yes, you have to, nothing is given to you, and then that's not how it had to be with the resources we have. But perhaps the youth are taking on the leadership of their spaces, and an aggregation of that perhaps will lead to a reborn Africa.
They're taking control of their destiny
Absolutely.
in their own hands. So do you think that the education actually is also a challenge in regards to some of these problems, like you said, white elephants, and this is, an issue of leadership. So, why would leaders in such positions, educated, exposed, experienced, would make such decisions? Are they forced? Is there some sort of superpowers that are sort of like forcing them or twisting their hands behind their backs to make such wrong decisions on behalf of the whole Africa? And it's not just one particular jurisdiction. If you look across the whole of the continent, we seem to have such, like you mentioned, white elephant project, and we kind of like sign deals and contract with other jurisdictions that don't actually benefit us. Are we being twisted? Is it lack of education? Is it just mere mistake or just carelessness? Is it corruption? I'm trying to put this in a better perspective for the viewers out there, to understand what is, because I'm sure some of our mothers and fathers out there who didn't have this sort of education that we have today still can't fathom on the problems and challenges that Africa has with all the resources. I'm trying to make them understand what really is the problem there. What is the problem? I know you've touched on a lot of them, but I still want to poke in there a little bit.
Fundamentally, where the carcass is, the vultures will gather. We need to understand that we're in a competition. So if you open up your system for people to take advantage, don't forget that those projects are not being done by Michael X Limited.
Right.
many of those projects are being done by some of the biggest in the world, and if that opportunity opens up with the incentives, not only do they make a killing from those projects, none of the base profit comes to Africa. It's repatriated. So the fact is, we have not understood the play. I don't think it's a lack of education. It's just the fact that we've not understood the competition, that we are in competition, and when you compete against someone that's more positioned to defeat your system or to take advantage, coming together with people of similar size, 5, 6, 7, let's say West African region decides to have a play on XYZ, the chances of having a more cost-effective project, it's just, I mean, some of those things are simple economics. I think that's where we've missed it. And when you're pieced apart, each country, a country of 1.2 million, trying to do a project of several billions for just that system, whereas it could have equity of say 10% in a project that covers 5, 6, 7 countries, and serves that same purpose. Now, first you save funds in terms of protecting of that infrastructure. There are more players, and there are more players, and and in the long run, you are able to then deploy the funds to other projects and infrastructure. So I think it's having that perspective, has really been missing, for Africa. And also, one thing I must touch on, as lawyers, I look at incentives being doled out by, countries. I'll give an example in history. In colonial India, the British government was trying to, save Delhi, the city of Delhi, from snakes. Yes, snakes, and the proposal was to have incentives for people to capture those snakes, and the developed government get some sort of incentives. Guess what happened? People then started to cultivate snakes and show it up to government. Guess what? Government had lower funds for doing that purpose, and then when that was stopped, then the snakes were released, and then you have more problems. So that example always rings in my mind as having solutions or preferring solutions or engineering solutions that make the problem worse. We do have a lot of that in Africa. We have opportunity to collaborate across the regions, but we do not. But we still continue to go for foreign investment, and then you need more of it. And it becomes a thing where the cost continues to increase and becomes a thing that overruns most of the system. So nearly every African country is in significant debt, and it becomes very difficult to get more funds for key sector projects. And your ratings, all those ratings are done by international agencies that are not Africa focused. Many times I feel Africa's just seen as a charity case for aid and and all
sidelined.
And I give credit to a few African presidents that recently said we need partners. We don't need more aid. We need serious partners for the long term. We need patient capital to develop our systems. So I don't think all is lost. We just have to start to face the right direction going forward and understand that we're in competition. And I think the global community does not owe you your development, you owe yourself. And then you have to understand, contextualize yourself and say, in class, where do I fall? What do I have? What is my contribution to the world, and what should I be demanding from the world around me? And who are my partners, potential partners who have similar needs and who have content to contribute to ensure that we achieve X, Y, Z. I feel it's simpler than it actually feels based on the level of underdevelopment we have in Africa. But until we start to face that right direction, we will just be speeding towards doom, so to speak.
Zion, you're a very smart man. I mean, I'm inspired by some of the metaphors and punchlines that you use. So for example, you just gave this one about this snake, and you always have punchlines where the carcasses, where the vultures would be. You have many of those, and I really find them interesting. So we have countries like Mauritius who are doing the most to stand out in Africa, helping with the cross-border transactions because of their compliant nature or regime, and that gives investors some sort of level of comfort in dealing with Africa as well. What can you say that Mauritius is doing exceptionally well? Is it the legal framework? Is it just leadership again? Or is it because it's just a small, tiny island, you know, that doesn't have oil and all those sort of resources that the other African countries have? But if you look at such a country, very small island, but they're ticking all the boxes. What can you say is the difference? Mauritius seems to attract a lot of investors and investment there, and why is it not replicable to other African countries? I mean, I'm speaking from a very naive point of view when it comes to those leadership
I think
roles.
I think Mauritius is a success story, even though it's still an underachiever when you look at it. I think it's one of the countries that's been able to take a model from the world. Look at Singapore, look at UAE,
Right.
and has developed a financial system.
Right.
It's one country that does have systems that
Right.
work,
Right.
and when you see that it's one of the best performing countries economically. I am not surprised because it's about systems, and your systems will go through the stress test. They will fail sometimes. They will be close to failure, but Mauritius was on the grey list. It's back in the good books, so to speak. Now South Africa is on the grey list.
Right.
So what can South Africa learn from Mauritius in navigating that? The fact is, you need to develop something that goes beyond individuals in power, the executive, whatever it is. You need to develop something that stands the test of time.
Right.
We don't have much of posterity thinking in Africa. Even when we do good projects, we're not thinking about how it fits into the world in, let's say 50 years. We don't look that far, and we have to, and systems help that because they must evolve as well. And so Mauritius, I would say, is a success story, but what it represents to Africa, all of the offshoring, group company structures in Africa should be coming from there, and there's proper support, African support to that country as the African hub for financial services and all of that. By the time you develop that, you can then tap into that and have some sort of agreement across board. It still represents that to a certain extent, but I would give Mauritius some credit. Understanding the system in terms of electricity, although it's a small country, it's one of few with about 100%.
Very stable, yeah.
So there's a lot to learn from there. They have taken real world examples and adopted it in a way that works, and that's perhaps one of the things African nations you have. Because there's the copy and paste opportunity, but in the right way to ensure that you're not misusing tools that do not fit your systems. And leadership must not be easy. It has to be careful, deliberate thought. You have to bring in your brains, to come together and fashion a way forward. And for as long as you don't have systems to protect those, discretion will be the order of the day.
Right.
And then when someone gets it wrong, it's easier for one person to get it wrong than for a system, to get it wrong. A system that has trained itself,
Right.
that's been through, several experiences and has come together to say this is how the direction we're facing, is also able to advise government and, get things going. Yeah.
So you're an expert when it comes to legal affairs and project financing. And still on the topic of Mauritius setting an example to Africa as a whole, what can you say about your experience? I know you've been in Mauritius yourself a couple of times, and what can you say about your experience when it comes to the audience, businesses, entrepreneurs that are struggling with doing business in Africa when it comes to project fund? I mean, there's several projects ongoing in Africa, and when it comes to financing, that's where the challenge is. And at some point, also, you realize that the challenge is not just that the investors are not interested, but when it comes to the jurisdiction that they are operating or they're going to invest in, there's lack of confidence there. So, from your experience, what can you say about Mauritius playing that role to help investors to gain that level of confidence or access financing from other parts of the world? What can you summarize for us on that regard?
I mean, Mauritius can play a role. I think in terms of aggregating funds for key sector projects across the continent, or funds for development of technology, specific industries, the growth industries that could really do a lot of good for Africa, because that system has been able to gain acceptance globally, warehousing a lot of those funds for significant impact. Talking of multi-billion funds could come from there, so that everyone then has a project or a program to channel things through Mauritius, not just because it's Mauritius, but because it is an African country.
Absolutely.
And that has been successful in its financial services setup. Channel that with that same mindset, of the trade we want in Africa, and bring all of that into, key sector projects, across the continent. I think to a large extent with the type of, segmented regulations and laws that we have for some of those things, many of these things will still be done, individually, and perhaps one country cannot mop up all of the funding that will go, across the continent. But significantly, it can progressively play a bigger role, as a system that the world relates to. In many of my conversations with foreign investors, they talk about Mauritius. They feel like perhaps there's a lot of documentation, requests, and it could be cumbersome and all that, but that might not always be a bad thing, because also when that's not requested, then investors are wary of the level of thoroughness. Because of that interaction, of that reputation, perhaps more can be done through that. But Mauritius itself, must then have that conversation, and I feel African countries do not have many conversations with themselves, especially countries, like Mauritius, and having an Africa play. I feel the African Union has not been very effective in my view. That's a personal opinion, but I feel organizations like the Afrexim Bank have had more impact, even than, for me, the African Development Bank. We need to start to understand that all these organizations, the focus is real impact and funding real issues. I feel some of these organizations actually fund foreign-owned projects more than African projects, and that becomes difficult because you are only setting them up to be more capable, whereas the local capabilities will either be stagnant or fall away entirely. There are myriad of issues, and but the thing is, understanding what the problem is, I think, is one step to getting to start to plug them. And as I said, the ability to actually ask for more on the world stage, to say Africa must be given X, Y, Z, and you must understand not in terms of aid, but these are the facts. I even feel that ratings for African nations, they are unfair because we have not had the opportunities. We're far behind in certain ways. Especially countries like Nigeria and the DRC, whose prominence would actually lead to the prominence of Africa. I feel African nations need to rally around developing those places, so that there's that externality that can develop the rest of Africa. We must have it as a project, there must be a Project Africa. I do not see that. I do not feel the Africa Free Continental, trade area actually does that. Right. The lip service it pays to movement of people hardly mentions it. It is an indication that we're not ready. I'll be very frank about that.
I like your frankness. And that's one thing I like about you.
Until we get that sorted, understand that ideologically we're not a single, entity that can compete until we have, those kind of things sorted. And we're competing against a world that's moving, in geometric proportions. So we do need to understand that some of those things have to be tackled head on. And until we do that, I think we're significantly behind. We won't be able to really get ahead.
Zion, I have some very interesting and good news for your clients that talk about Mauritius and do think that there's a lot of paperwork to be done. Tell your investors, tell your clients, tell them they don't have to worry anymore about the cumbersome paperwork because Orama Corporate Services is there to help them when it comes to advisory services, setting up their companies in Mauritius. When it comes to the paperwork, Orama Corporate Services will handle all those paperwork for them. When it comes to signing, all they have to do is to read, see their lawyers to check to show everything is fine, and just sign it. They don't have to worry about the paperwork. Orama Corporate Services is your #1 management company in Mauritius, helping you with your company incorporation processes, trusteeship, corporate trusteeship services, and setting up investment funds in Mauritius to help your business operate smoothly across the African continent. Zion, you have said some very, very, very serious, you've given us some very good, serious information here that we have taken. I'm sure our viewers are very interested and they're partaking in this show very, very well. Speaking on Mauritius, before I go on to the final question, can we wrap this up? What do you think of the narrative? We still have investors and businesses that are still using other offshore jurisdictions or international financial centers that are not within Africa. You spoke about patriotism, being able to harness and patronize our own African-owned institutions and product services and policies that are there to benefit us. But there we go today. We still have, Africans who are using other jurisdictions. I don't want to mention any. Not to say they're not also equally important. They have their roles to play. But I believe that Mauritius has that it's very competitive and has all the necessary ingredients to thrive a business compared to, and even compared to some of the other jurisdictions. And what do you have to say? What do you think about our own, investors who are still some of them, maybe they don't know so much about Mauritius, I think. Maybe they haven't delved or had anyone to talk to them about anyway, but that's what Orama is here to do, to tell you a little bit about Mauritius. Do you think that, is it that they choose to use other offshore jurisdictions just because there is a narrative that because it belongs to the United Kingdom, or because it's an European based IFC? For example, I've had interaction with a prospective client whom was contemplating of using Mauritius and another jurisdiction which actually belongs to the United Kingdom. But he's an African. He thinking because Mauritius is Africa, the world or investors won't find it attractive. So he's thinking of actually using another jurisdiction somewhere else. And I found that to be very, it was sort of, I'll say, it was sad to learn that. And I sat back and, thought of the narrative, and it transcends across a few other things within how we think.
I think don't be offended by that. I think investors are not in the business of feel good positioning. You understand? To a large extent, you have to protect your investment.
Right.
until Mauritius itself starts to build its narrative and reaches out to industry across board.
Right.
It can have there's already the prejudice which exists globally in the world. Whichever organization is using the United Kingdom has already gained prominence.
Right.
That opportunity exists. So if there is an African program to say, we ourselves will have our rating agencies, will stress test this. If you trade, in Africa, use this. There are certain advantages and opportunities. There has to be a program around it. If I have funds, I would want to put in the best, place to protect it. And they say if the devil is better than the angel you do not know. Mauritius could be that angel, but the fact that it's not known and understood, or it's not gained the prominence or the reputation, so to speak, I wouldn't blame investors for going elsewhere. But there has to be a proactive stance from Mauritius, from the African continent, in terms of how we want our economic play to be, and then start to promote, have platforms to promote the best of us, to say increasingly this is harder to African rating agencies are important as well, to say within Africa this is our A class.
Absolutely.
Understand and give, then start to compute and say there's no reason why this A classification for Mauritius is not the same as. You even bring out the advantages. It's a narrative, and one thing we've not done properly in Africa is build our own narrative.
Absolutely.
The World Bank says hex, okay, this is the position of this country or this crop in the economic sphere. Because of that, we have to
accept it,
do the work. There's no I don't think there's no free lunch, as they say. So some of those things we have to conceptualize and develop content, African content, so to speak, and then it will catch on, as the years. Business people are not sentimental, and that's the successful ones, I say, are not very sentimental, except you set up as a not-for-profit organization.
Right.
And most of them are never, well structured or profitable in any way, even for the projects there. So I wouldn't be offended. I would just say there's an opportunity. If Africa is, now facing the right direction to start to promote African content, which is things like Mauritius financial services, what it offers is as good as anywhere in the world. But then it needs the promotion, it needs the narrative to give it that strength.
So Mauritius needs to promote its own jurisdiction really well as Africa's own international financial center. Zion, you have taken much of your time. I'm sure you are a very busy man and have a lot to do. What's next for Zion? Are we looking at Zion as the next future energy minister? Are we looking at Zion as the future president? Because I do confidently believe you have very unique and strong leadership qualities to help and push Africa forward to the level and the pace where we need to be. What is next for Zion?
Well, certainly I won't tell you my next move, but one thing I can say is, I believe in Africa. I've, been on the African continent all my life, and the all 9 yards of what it takes for success exists in Africa. There's an African play, beautiful play, not just in culture and hats, as seen globally. When people think of Africa, they think of there's an economic play. I've been to several countries across the continent very often. Countries like South Sudan, I've been there 10 times. I've seen from where the airport was, shed to what it is now, and see the development. We just need to connect the dots. We have, a very beautiful economic story. We have a beautiful energy story. Despite the fact that 600 million people do not have access to electricity, we do have energy beyond all the capacity we need. We have a nascent, economic, expansion. So there's those opportunities. Billionaires will be made. If that's a measure that the world looks at, will be made from this continent. Basically, just barely solely on, the content Africa has. And I think the dots are being connected. Countries like Nigeria, I think they're beginning to understand their positioning. I think about, I'm an oil and gas lawyer, so I'll tell you about the pipeline from Nigeria, to North Africa, and you see that along each point, several countries can make use of that, and that's, deployment of energy across the region. That's trade, that's infrastructure that can, really work for a long time. So there are, bright spots in all of this, but we need to connect the dots, connect with Mauritius, as you say, to warehouse, the financial services, have holding companies set up from there with their continuous engagement with the rest of the global community. And as they gain that prominence and, respect, that helps, and provide incentives for, African businesses to warehouse their funds, warehouse all of that there. There could be, really great story. And it's be fresh, new, homegrown, from Africa. So I would always subscribe to that. That would always be part of whatever move, I had.
Thank you very much, Zion. Share with us for the young and upcoming entrepreneurs and African patriots who are looking to become something for themselves. What can you say to the youth about any few words to motivate the youth? What can you say about to them? To anything that you want to share with your viewers? It's over to you.
Well, I think generally, in the past, people would say, hard work. You understand that you have a system, that basically would not give you all the tools, for the world, but there's always that then creates an opportunity to be, create those tools,
right.
Not just for yourself, but, for posterity, for people around you. I always say private sector governance, private sector leadership. People would have to prospect, and young people have to know that they have to make mistakes. Most successful people have more mistakes than successes, but it's in the mix of all of those mistakes and all of those errors and all those failings that, the success comes. And because people focus, see the success and do not see the failures, it then seems like, people have always been successful all their lives, but certainly that's not the case. So there's an opportunity in this new era, especially with information technology, to prospect, bring up ideas, and collaborate, with people of like minds and create something. People reward value. That's what it is. And we're here as lawyers, for example, because we can provide legal advice. That's the value we offer. And if we offer it for long enough, well enough, we can only grow. So just understanding the concept of value creation, look around you and create some value, and might not be the first one, might not be the 10th one, but that process of value creation becomes sort of second nature, and one day that value that's created at that point, just at the right time, as I say, luck is preparation, meeting opportunity. So, I mean, if there's anything, I'll just say, continue to create value, whether it's seen, whether it's appreciated, whatever system, someday that, pays off. Not just for you, but for posterity. I think thinking not just for yourself, most times actually gets you success for yourself. That's the way the world works.
Thank you very much. Welcome to another episode of our interactive session with corporate executives, where we interact with industry experts and very influential people in our society. And today we have here a very special guest, and his name is Zion Adeoye. He's the managing director of the Centurion Law Group. It's one of the largest law firms in Africa, with presence in almost all the 55 countries in Africa. It's also listed on the German Stock Exchange. My name is Michael Adeoye, and this is sponsored by Orama Corporate Services, your number one management company in Mauritius, helping with all your corporate advisory services, incorporation of your business in Mauritius, corporate trusteeship and investment funds, Incorporation in Mauritius, helping you to navigate smoothly across Africa and the rest of the world when it comes to your business transactions. Zion, thank you very much for your time. You have made my day, and I'm sure my viewers out there have also benefited so much from the knowledge that you've spilled out there, and the insights that you've shared with us. We are very grateful, and we look forward to also spending some more time with you. But before I go, Zion, I'm sure people always see you as a very serious person, always suited up, always in the office, working long hours. Tell us, what is your favorite sport?
Well, I would say tennis for now, but it used to be soccer. Not always serious. I'm sure you've probably partied with me before, so you probably know that. Yes, of course, you have to work as hard as you play.
Absolutely.
As well to keep mind refreshed and all that. So yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, Zion, for your time on the show. I look forward to catching you again in the future for another episode where we can also delve deeper into other aspects of economic issues and solutions that would help Africa be a better place. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll speak again soon. Thank you. Bye.